The skyline of New York glowed against the darkening November sky as Marcus Castellano sat in his penthouse office on the 58th floor. At 42, he was one of the most feared men in the Northeast, a title he'd earned through ruthlessness, intelligence, and an unforgiving code. His tailored black suit hung perfectly on his broad shoulders, and his cold grey eyes reflected the city lights like polished steel. Behind him stretched floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a kingdom he'd built from blood and betrayal. His phone buzzed. Marcus didn't look away from the ledgers spread across his mahogany desk, a rare moment of solitude in his carefully orchestrated empire. His underboss, Vincent, knew better than to interrupt unless something significant demanded attention. The phone buzzed again, persistent. Marcus finally reached for it, his jaw tightening as he read the message. "Boss, we have a situation. It's about your mother." The words hung suspended in the air like poison. Marcus hadn't heard that word in 23 years. Mother. When he was 19, she'd vanished from his life without explanation, without goodbye. He'd been told she died in a car accident, a convenient story his father had fed him while keeping her memory locked away. His father, the old Don, had never permitted questions. The subject was closed, sealed with finality and threats. Marcus had built an empire to fill the void. He'd become so powerful that no one dared speak of the boy who'd once waited by a window, wondering why his mother had stopped coming home. That boy was dead, buried beneath layers of crime and calculated cruelty, or so Marcus had believed. He called Vincent immediately. "Talk," he commanded. "Boss, we received intelligence from our contacts at the hospital in Queens. A woman checked herself in for emergency surgery. When admitting staff ran her background, they found something. Her maiden name is connected to your family, specifically to documentation from your childhood address before your father restructured everything." Marcus's hand tightened around the phone. "Get to the point." "The name on the medical records is Catherine Castellano. The nurses say she's asking for someone. She keeps saying a name, Marcus. She's saying she needs to find her son before it's too late. Boss, I think it's her." The world tilted. Marcus had built an empire on control, on the careful orchestration of every variable. He manipulated outcomes, moved men like chess pieces, predicted consequences before they unfolded. But this unraveled everything. His breathing remained steady, but his hand moved to the window. Outside, the city continued its indifferent dance, unaware that inside this tower, a man was being transported back to a moment of profound vulnerability. "Get me everything," Marcus said quietly. "Medical records, history, how she survived, why she disappeared, and most importantly, who kept her from me." He ended the call and stood motionless, staring at the city below. For the first time in decades, Marcus Castellano felt something shift beneath his carefully constructed armor. Fear. No, something worse. Hope. The Queen's General Hospital smelled of antiseptic and desperation, a scent that Marcus Castellano actively avoided. Hospitals represented chaos, uncertainty, situations he couldn't control with money or intimidation. Yet here he stood in a private corridor on the 4th floor, his security team posted at discreet distances, his presence causing nervous energy among the staff. A simple phone call to the hospital administrator had arranged privacy, discretion, and immediate access. Room 447. The number seemed to pulse as Marcus approached. Vincent had provided complete information. Catherine Castellano, 65 years old, admitted with complications from an earlier gunshot wound that had never fully healed. She'd been living quietly in New Jersey under an assumed name, working as a nurse, keeping no connections to her past. She'd survived all these years in hiding, alone, believing her son had grown up with a father who told him lies. Marcus pushed open the door. The woman in the hospital bed bore the weight of 2 decades in exile. Her hair, once dark like his own, had turned silver white. Deep lines marked her face, not the graceful lines of age, but the etched marks of hardship and worry. Despite her frailty, there was something in her features that struck him with visceral recognition. His jaw, his cheekbones, her eyes, when they opened and met his, were the same grey as his, a grey that had haunted him in mirrors for 42 years without explanation. Marcus! She breathed his name like a prayer, like a question, like the answer to everything. Her voice trembled with an emotion so raw that Marcus, accustomed to steely command, felt something fracture inside him. "How do you know that name?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "How do I know my own son's name? Oh, Marcus, come closer, please. Let me look at you, let me—" She reached out, her hand shaking, and Marcus moved forward almost involuntarily. He was no longer the feared Don of New York. He was a boy seeing his mother's face for the first time since he was 19. "I was told you died," he said flatly, unable to process the information flooding his consciousness. "I know," Catherine whispered. "Your father told you that. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." The endearment undid something in him, a memory of childhood unconditional love he'd suppressed so thoroughly that it felt like violence to resurrect it now. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Catherine's hands trembled as she gestured for him to sit. She spoke slowly, carefully, as though each word might shatter them both. She told him about falling in love with his father, about believing he was legitimate, about discovering his criminal empire only after marriage. She described the violence, the threats, the moment she'd threatened to leave and take young Marcus with her. She recounted the night his father had her shot in their own home, how she'd managed to escape to a neighbor's house, how she'd been hospitalized in secret while her death was arranged. "I wanted to find you," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "Every single day for 23 years I wanted to contact you. But your father had resources, connections. He told the doctors he'd find me and kill me if I revealed the truth. More importantly, he said he'd use you against me. He said if I tried to take you, he'd hurt you. He said if I tried to tell you, he'd make you think I was a liar, a traitor. So I stayed away. I stayed alive so that one day, when you were old enough, when he couldn't control you anymore, I could find a way to reach you." "Then why are you in a hospital under a name that's traceable?" Marcus demanded, his mind already operating in strategic mode. "My heart," Catherine said simply. "It's failing, Marcus. The gunshot wound never healed properly. Scar tissue, complications. The doctors give me maybe 6 months. I didn't want to die without knowing if you'd forgiven me, if you'd ever understood that I left because I loved you, not despite it." Marcus sat motionless. The woman before him was his mother, yet she was a stranger. He was a man trained to see threats everywhere, and yet he saw none in her. Instead, he saw vulnerability. He saw sacrifice. He saw the female version of his own stubborn determination to survive, reflected back at him across 2 decades of separation. "I need to verify everything," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "Your medical records, your history since then. I need proof this isn't a setup, a con, a trap set by someone trying to manipulate me." Catherine nodded, understanding. "Of course. I expected nothing less. You're your father's son. Cautious, intelligent, but Marcus, you're also my son, and I hope that somewhere in you, you remember the boy who used to fall asleep with his head on my lap while I sang to him. That boy is still in there, isn't he? 3 weeks of investigation yielded a truth so thoroughly documented that even Marcus's most skeptical instincts couldn't deny it. Catherine Castellano was authentic. The medical records from 1999 matched the shooting incident. The DNA tests that Marcus had conducted through private channels confirmed biological relation. The paperwork from underground networks that had helped her disappear was verified through sources that had no reason to lie. Everything aligned. Everything was real. His mother had spent 23 years in exile, raising herself from the ashes of violence, never allowing herself to claim the identity she'd lost. Marcus sat in the hospital cafeteria, across from Catherine, who was recovering remarkably well following successful heart surgery. The tension between them had evolved into something more complex, the fragile beginnings of reconnection, complicated by decades of absence and the unspoken knowledge of what his father had done. "Your father was a ruthless man," Catherine said, pushing food around her plate without eating. "I didn't fully understand it until I was already married. By then, I was pregnant with you. I thought love could change him, could reach something human inside all that darkness. I was naive. I was also trapped." "Why didn't you take me with you when you left?" Marcus asked. It was the question that had haunted him since the hospital room, the question that contained all the complexity of the abandoned child confronting abandonment. "Because I was shot in our home while you were at school," Catherine said quietly. "I barely survived. The people your father sent made it clear. If I ever tried to claim you or contact you, they'd ensure you paid the price for it. And honestly, Marcus, I thought about it. I thought about disappearing completely and hiring someone to extract you from his custody. But then I realized your father had already indoctrinated you. The few times I tried to see you through neighbors' windows, you were surrounded by his men, being groomed for his empire. Taking you from him at that point might have made you hate me, might have made you run back to him." Marcus absorbed this with the cold precision of a strategist. "So you sacrificed yourself." "I sacrificed the possibility of raising you," Catherine corrected, "but not the knowledge that you were alive, that you survived him, that you became powerful enough to survive. I watched your rise through hospital networks, through nurse friends who connected me to people, through careful research. I made sure you survived. That was enough. It had to be." "He died 2 years ago," Marcus said. "I inherited everything. I restructured his entire operation, cleaned out his corruption, eliminated rivals he'd made. I became stronger than he ever was." Catherine's face transformed. It was like watching sadness lift from a landscape. "Then you're free," she whispered. "All these years I prayed you wouldn't become him. I watched from a distance for signs that you'd absorbed his worst qualities. Instead, I saw you building something different. Strategic, yes. Powerful, absolutely. But not cruel for cruelty's sake. You have conditions. You have principles. That's mine in you, Marcus. That's the part of me I gave you before he corrupted everything." Marcus found himself reaching across the table. He took his mother's hand, something so foreign to him that it felt like an entirely new language. Her skin was soft, marked with age spots and scars from her years as a nurse. She squeezed his fingers gently, and Marcus understood, for perhaps the first time in his life, what it meant to be held. "I want to bring you home," he said, "not back to the past, forward into something new. I have security, resources, medical experts. I can give you the life your exile stole." "But can you give it to me as your mother?" Catherine asked carefully. "Or will I always be the ghost who appeared to complicate your empire?" "You're my mother," Marcus said simply. It felt like the most dangerous thing he'd ever admitted, more dangerous than confessing to any crime. "You were my mother before I became who I am now. And I think maybe it's time I became someone who can honor that, who can admit that part of my foundation comes from love instead of just fear and violence." Catherine's tears spilled over. Through them she smiled, a smile that contained 23 years of grief, sacrifice, and finally, absolution. The hospital cafeteria continued its mundane activity around them, unaware that inside this space something profound was being rebuilt. A man who had spent his life commanding empires was learning to surrender to something more powerful, the uncomplicated love of family. 6 months later, the Marcus Castellano penthouse had undergone a metamorphosis that no one in his organization could have predicted. Where once sterile minimalism dominated, a space designed to convey power through emptiness, warmth now permeated every room. Oil paintings hung on walls that had been deliberately bare. Photographs adorned surfaces that once reflected only glass and cold marble. In the study, Catherine's manuscript lay in organized stacks, pages marked with red tabs indicating sections she was refining. The refrigerator, previously stocked only with expensive water and imported coffee, now held homemade food that Catherine prepared on days when her energy allowed. The entire penthouse had been transformed into something neither of them had expected: a home. Catherine sat in the window seat that overlooked Manhattan, the same seat where she'd spent countless hours during her recovery. She'd grown stronger, her complexion regaining color, her movements fluid again. The surgery had been successful, the scar tissue from the old gunshot wound finally properly addressed. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, speaking in measured terms about a prognosis that no longer measured time in months, but potentially in years. Catherine had embraced each day with the intensity of someone who understood what it meant to live under a death sentence and then be granted a reprieve. She was writing, not the casual journaling she'd done in exile, but a full manuscript chronicling her journey. The literary agent Marcus had hired was enthusiastic. Publishers were interested. Catherine's story, a woman who survived violence, lived quietly for 2 decades, and was finally reunited with the son she thought she'd lost forever, resonated on a deeply human level. But Catherine's motivation for writing had nothing to do with commercial success. She was writing for truth, for testimony, for the historical record of a woman who refused to be erased. Vincent called. "The board meeting is starting in 20 minutes, Marcus announced from the study doorway, his tone carefully neutral. The underboss had adapted to Marcus's mother's presence with the diplomatic grace of a man who'd survived multiple regime changes. He'd learned quickly that Catherine had influence over Marcus that transcended the organizational hierarchy. She was not merely his mother, she was his conscience made flesh. "Tell them I'll be delayed," Marcus said, stepping into the living area. "Mother needs to finish her thought." This phrase, seemingly simple on its surface, carried the weight of profound reclamation. For decades, Marcus had answered to no one's needs but his own strategic calculations and the needs of his expanding empire. He'd been trained by his father to view personal attachments as liabilities, emotional connections as vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Now, at 42, he was learning to restructure his entire existence around a recognition that had been violently denied to him, that acknowledging his mother's needs didn't weaken him. It made him stronger. "I'm slowing you down," Catherine said, setting down her pen. "I know what that means in your world. A man who's distracted is a man who can be exploited, a man who privileges personal concerns over organizational matters is a man who's already lost control." "No," Marcus said firmly, sitting beside her on the window seat. The Manhattan skyline glittered before them, a kingdom of lights that represented his power, yet increasingly felt like an empty monument. "You're not slowing me down. You're teaching me something I never learned, something my father deliberately taught me not to value, that there are some things more important than consolidating power, that a man can be strong and still acknowledge where that strength originates. That I can honor what you sacrificed and what you continue to sacrifice by being here in my world, exposed to people who might not understand, without perpetuating the cycle of violence that necessitated your exile in the first place." "Are you truly changing the organization?" Catherine asked carefully. She understood enough now about his world to recognize that sentiment could be perceived as weakness by those trained to recognize only force as legitimate currency. Her question contained genuine concern, not skepticism. She knew what it meant to be a target, to live under constant threat. She didn't want that for her son. "I'm restructuring it fundamentally," Marcus confirmed. "We're moving away from the enterprises that generated profit through human suffering. The drug operations are being liquidated. The street-level criminal activities are being handed off to smaller organizations who are willing to accept the risk and the consequences. We're transitioning into legitimate enterprises, real estate development, financial services, technology investments. We'll still be powerful. We'll still be protected. We'll still have influence that extends into political circles and judicial systems. But we're not expanding the body count anymore. I've learned from watching you. Survival doesn't require you to become your oppressor. It doesn't require perpetuating the violence that nearly destroyed you. Catherine closed her manuscript carefully, marking her place with a handwritten bookmark. She turned to face her son directly, and in her grey eyes, eyes that matched his own, there was something he'd never expected to see directed at him: unconditional pride. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "I've spent my entire adult life being proud of you from a distance, through hospital windows, through newspaper articles, through the careful research I conducted to understand who you'd become. It feels strange to say it directly. It feels strange to be in the same room and be able to tell you these things without fear of being tracked down. But Marcus, I need you to know, I'm proud of you, not because you became powerful. I'm proud of you because you became powerful and then chose to become something more." "Then keep saying it," Marcus said. He reached for her hand, a gesture that had become their private language. "I spent my entire childhood waiting to hear those words from you. Better late than never." That evening, Marcus sat at the head of a mahogany conference table in the private boardroom, surrounded by men who had served his father and now served him. These were not ordinary businessmen. These were men trained in the old ways, men for whom power existed only as a function of violence, men who understood wealth only when it was extracted through fear. Among them sat Vincent, who had proven himself capable of adaptation. There was also Dominic, his father's oldest underboss, a man whose loyalty had never wavered, even as his methods were beginning to seem archaic. And there were newer members, younger men who'd grown up in Marcus's regime and hadn't known the old Don, who understood that evolution was necessary for survival. Marcus stood and addressed them directly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that commanded attention without volume. "We are divesting from drug trafficking," he announced. "All operations, domestic and international, are being liquidated over the next 18 months. We're eliminating standing contracts on rival families and organizations. The streets will be quieter, significantly quieter. We're transitioning our financial investments into real estate development, specifically into projects that revitalize distressed urban communities. We're establishing legitimate financial advisory services. We're investing in emerging technology sectors. This is not a retreat. This is a strategic evolution." The reactions were immediate and varied. Dominic's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the table. One of the younger soldiers shifted in his seat, uncertainty crossing his features. Vincent, unsurprisingly, remained perfectly still, his expression neutral. "You're dismantling everything your father built," Dominic said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decades of service and the implicit criticism of a man watching his life's work destroyed. It was not framed as a question. "No," Marcus corrected, and his tone shifted to something sharper. "I'm strengthening it. An empire built on fear is fragile. An empire built on fear collapses the moment someone more fearless emerges. An empire built on mutual benefit, on legitimate power, on influence that doesn't depend on constant bloodshed and replacement of dead soldiers, that endures. That adapts. That passes to the next generation with accumulated power rather than depleted resources." "And if someone challenges your authority?" Vincent asked. The question seemed genuine, not challenging. Vincent was asking a practical question about a practical concern. What happens if rivals interpret this restructuring as weakness and attack? "Then they learn that strength doesn't contradict intelligence," Marcus said quietly, his eyes moving to lock with Vincent's. "That you can be merciful without being weak. That the most powerful move isn't always destruction, It's often containment. It's understanding that killing competition costs resources. Rendering them irrelevant through superior strategy costs nothing and leaves them unable to retaliate. They learn that Marcus Castellano has evolved beyond their paradigm, and that's more intimidating than any threat. He paused, letting the words settle. My father built an empire on fear. I'm going to build something that lasts because it's impossible to defeat through the methods he taught me to use. Over the following weeks, the restructuring began. Operations were liquidated. Assets were converted. Contracts were either fulfilled or carefully, methodically terminated. Some of the men in Marcus's organization adapted. Vincent became his chief financial advisor, his tactical mind turning toward legitimate business strategy with remarkable ease. Others struggled or quietly departed, seeking out older organizations where the old ways still dominated. A few became liabilities and had to be addressed, but Marcus ensured these situations were handled with surgical precision. No unnecessary violence, just the careful removal of those who couldn't accept the new direction. Catherine watched all of this with the careful observation of someone who understood the stakes. She'd spent her entire adult life understanding that the world was complex, that good men could do terrible things when survival was at stake, that the line between victim and perpetrator was far less clear than the world suggested. She didn't judge her son for the things he'd done in his father's name. She honored what he was choosing to become. Late one night, Catherine stood in the study looking at the photographs on the wall, pictures that had been added over the past months. There was a photo of Marcus as a child, before his father had taken that innocence and weaponized it. There were recent photographs of Catherine and Marcus together, taken since her recovery. There was a picture of Marcus's father, stern and powerful, a man who'd shaped his son through fear and control. Catherine studied this last photograph for a long time. I thought about him so many times, she said quietly when Marcus entered the room. When you were being built into an instrument of his power, I wondered if there was anything I could do to prevent it. I've spent 23 years wondering if I could have made a difference, if I'd had the courage to try. Mother, Marcus said gently, you did the only thing you could do. You survived. You kept yourself alive. And by being here now, by proving that survival was possible even in exile, by showing me through your existence that love could endure, you changed everything. You gave me the template for something other than what he wanted me to become. The two of them stood together looking at the photographs, the history of a family broken and being carefully, deliberately reconstructed on new foundations. Outside, New York glowed against the November darkness, indifferent to the profound transformations occurring within the tower. 3 months later, Marcus Castellano stood in a community center in a neighborhood that had been decimated by the very drug operations he'd just dismantled. He'd funded the renovation personally, using profits from his restructured organization to transform a condemned building into a resource center for families affected by addiction. Catherine stood beside him, her strength fully returned, her manuscript now with publishers. She was recognized by a few people in the community. She'd worked as a nurse in this neighborhood during her years in exile, had helped countless people without ever revealing who she was or where she'd come from. As they walked through the center, watching counselors work with families, watching young people access educational resources, watching community members embrace something other than desperation, Marcus understood that this moment was worth far more than any empire built on violence. Your father would have hated this, Catherine said quietly. Yes, Marcus agreed. He would have. That's how I know it's right. That evening, Marcus and Catherine returned to the penthouse. The skyline still glowed. The empire still existed, still wielded power, still influenced outcomes in the legitimate world and in the shadows that bordered it. But it was no longer built on the premise that human suffering was an acceptable cost of dominance. It was built on something more sustainable, The recognition that strength could evolve, that power could be restructured, that a man could honor his mother's sacrifice by refusing to perpetuate the violence that necessitated it. As Catherine settled into the window seat with her manuscript and Marcus reviewed financial reports for the new legitimate enterprises, a rhythm emerged, the routine of a family learning to exist together after decades of separation. It was not perfect. There were moments when the old training reasserted itself, when Marcus felt the cold calculation his father had embedded into his thinking. But now he had something his father had never provided, a counterbalance, a reminder of what was possible when survival didn't require becoming a monster. In the quiet of the penthouse, as the city lights reflected off the glass and the Manhattan night pressed against the windows, Marcus Castellano was finally learning what it meant to be someone worthy of his mother's sacrifice. He was learning that the most revolutionary act for a man of power was the choice to become better, not for the world, but for the woman who'd loved him fiercely enough to endure 2 decades of exile so that he might one day have the freedom to choose a different path. The empire continued, the power remained, but transformed by love, restructured by conscience, and animated by the truth that his mother had survived to tell. Marcus's new kingdom was built on foundations that no amount of force could shake.